Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive focused on the foundational framework of global environmental governance. When we talk about tackling massive challenges like climate change or industrial pollution, we often focus on treaties or governmental pledges.
Hmm.
But the real power, I think, often lies in the handful of legal principles that allow judges and regulators to actually enforce those promises.
Yes,
This is
exactly.
one of those deep dives where the rules written decades ago are actively being tested and redefined in courtrooms today, determining the future of resource management and corporate accountability, really on a global scale.
That's absolutely right. We're moving beyond just the headlines to the bedrock of
Mhm.
policy. We're diving into a stack of material detailing three powerful foundational principles that essentially form the DNA of modern international environmental law.
And they all stem from one place, right?
Right. All stemming directly from the 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. And these aren't just, academic concepts for diplomats. They are robust legal tools used across jurisdictions, often simultaneously, to force accountability and to change behavior.
Exactly. Our mission today is to give you a shortcut to understanding these three essential pillars: the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, and the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR.
Right.
We want to understand not just what their definitions are, but the legal, economic, and I guess philosophical revolutions they represent. And critically, how courts around the world, from the Supreme Courts of India and the Philippines to the highest courts in Europe and the US, have actually applied them to enforce real, quantifiable change.
It's a journey into where legal philosophy meets real world pollution, starting with what is maybe the most forward looking concept: the idea of mandatory action before a disaster strikes.
So let's start with Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration, the precautionary principle, or
Mhm.
PP. At its simplest, it sounds a bit like look before you leap. But legally, this principle it's absolutely revolutionary because it fundamentally challenges the historical requirement of proven causation. What is the core technical definition we need to work with here?
So the core definition is quite precise. The precautionary principle requires proactive measures to prevent environmental harm, even if full scientific certainty is lacking regarding the risks involved. It explicitly mandates prevention over cure.
Okay.
The text Principle 15 is really clear on this. It says, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, the lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation.
I want to focus on that lack of full scientific certainty clause
Yeah.
because traditional common law, specifically tort law, is deeply, deeply rooted in requiring demonstrable proof of causation.
Right. The but-for test.
Exactly. If my factory ruins your field, I have to prove that A, my action caused, B, your damage. If you can't prove the chemical caused the cancer, you lose. It's that simple.
And that's the revolutionary feature. Environmental harm, especially systemic pollution like climate change or biodiversity loss, it operates on a time scale and a complexity level that traditional law simply wasn't equipped for.
Right, it's too slow.
Far too slow. If you have a new chemical compound, it might take 20 years and millions of tons of runoff before the long-term, irreversible ecological or health effects become scientifically undeniable. And by then, well, the harm is done.
The damage is already baked in.
Exactly.
Hmm.
The precautionary principle steps in and says, we cannot afford to wait for absolute scientific proof when the potential damage is serious and irreversible.
This shift is just crucial. It acknowledges the inherent limitations of science in these really complex ecological systems.
Yeah.
We often have incomplete models or long latency periods for toxic exposure.
Mm.
So the PP operationalizes the concept of uncertainty rather than just risk. When we talk about standard risk assessment, we quantify known outcomes. There's a 10% chance of X happening.
Precisely. PP deals with scientific uncertainty situations where we don't even know the probability, or where the potential damage is so catastrophic that any probability, no matter how small, must be avoided. What's fascinating here is the mandate. This principle is designed specifically to address irreversible damage.
Things you can't undo.
Things you cannot undo, whether it's species extinction, permanent soil sterility, or long-term climate destabilization. It's a mandate to act on plausible scientific concern, not just wait for absolute scientific certainty.
Okay, so let's detail those revolutionary features a bit more. We've established that PP prioritizes prevention over cure and encourages action despite incomplete scientific evidence. But the truly disruptive, perhaps even revolutionary element is how it handles the burden of proof. It fundamentally changes the relationship between the regulator and the regulated industry.
Precisely. This shift is what gives the principle its practical teeth in a courtroom. Think about the historical regulatory default. In typical litigation, the regulatory body or the affected community, or maybe an NGO challenging the activity,
They bear the burden.
they bear the burden of proving that the activity is dangerous or harmful. This requires funding studies, hiring experts, waiting years for data. It's a massive, resource-intensive undertaking.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that entire model is reversed.
The precautionary principle flips that script entirely. It creates a mechanism for what we call reverse onus. It shifts the burden of proof onto the proponent of the potentially harmful activity.
So the company.
The company, the developer, yes. This means if a company wants to introduce a new technology, release a new chemical, or begin a major development in a sensitive area, they must now prove that the activity is safe, or at least that the risks are manageable and fully characterized, using the highest available scientific standard.
So the question changes from, can the environmentalists prove this will be a disaster, to, can the corporation prove this won't be a disaster?
Yeah.
That seems like an almost impossible standard to meet, especially for a new technology where the long-term effects are genuinely unknown.
It is deliberately stringent. It mandates prudence and internalizes the costs of scientific inquiry for the industry creating the risk. However, this is also where the principle faces its heaviest political and economic pushback.
I can imagine.
Critics argue that forcing a proponent to prove a negative, that something is absolutely safe over a 50-year horizon stifles innovation, blocks necessary infrastructure development, and is often weaponized by competitors to delay legitimate projects. But legally, this mechanism alone saves years of regulatory delay and potentially decades of irreversible environmental damage, particularly in the fields of biotechnology and synthetic chemistry.
The legal reasoning is sound, I get that. But what happens when that burden of proof is so high that only the largest corporations, the ones with the deepest pockets for massive safety studies and lobbying, can even attempt to meet it? Doesn't the PP ironically create a barrier to entry for smaller innovators who might offer less harmful alternatives but just can't afford the rigorous proof required?
That's a critical challenge, and it really speaks to how the PP must be administered. Courts usually adopt a tiered approach, so the level of required proof is proportionate to the plausible severity and magnitude of the potential harm.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Not at all. But you've hit on the core tension, balancing precaution against economic necessity and technological progress. In high-stakes cases involving, say, toxins or genetic modification, the courts have generally prioritized the preventative shield, arguing that the cost of cleanup, if they were wrong, would just dwarf any temporary economic benefit.
Okay, to make this concept tangible, let's look at 3 cornerstone cases from our source material that illustrate exactly how courts applied the precautionary principle. We'll start with the Indian Supreme Court in Vellore Citizens Welfare Forum v. Union of India in 1996. This case really defined the application of PP in one of the world's most rapidly industrializing economies.
This is a foundational case for Indian environmental jurisprudence. The facts were simple but devastating. Hundreds of tanneries in the state of Tamil Nadu were releasing massive volumes of untreated, highly toxic effluents.
What kind of stuff are we talking about?
We're talking heavy metals, chromium, other chemicals directly into the Pella River basin. The sheer volume of this discharge had contaminated surface water, severely depleted groundwater tables, and caused widespread health and agricultural crises.
So the harm was ongoing and obvious, but I guess the long-term scientific finality on issues like soil sterility or specific cancer clusters might still have been years away. How did the court use the PP here?
Well, the Supreme Court of India didn't wait for those long-term scientific studies. They explicitly integrated the precautionary principle into Indian domestic law, ruling that it was essential to sustainable development.
So they just adopted it.
They adopted it wholesale. The court stated that where there is even a reasonable suspicion of irreversible harm, immediate measures must be taken. They required the polluters to adopt cleaner practices and install primary treatment facilities without delay. The ruling prioritized the prevention of continued, ongoing environmental damage over waiting for scientific certainty on the final scope of the long-term damage.
This established the PP not just as a policy goal, but as an enforceable, justiciable right in India.
Precisely. And that led directly to our second case, AP Pollution Control Board v. Professor M.V. Naidu in 1999, which further refined the PP, shifting the focus from existing pollution to regulatory approval for future risk.
Tell us about the facts here. This case revolved around establishing a hazardous industry, specifically a potentially polluting unit in a sensitive area.
Yes, it was about preemptive control. The court recognized that the moment of maximum regulatory power is before construction begins.
Right, before the concrete is poured.
Exactly. The court ruled that authorities must act with extreme caution when weighing new developments, particularly those involving hazardous materials or processes. They established the need for a new instrument to govern decision-making, where the default assumption shifts from "this is allowed unless proven harmful" to "this is not allowed until proven safe."
A complete reversal.
Total reversal. The court mandated that if there is a reasonable suspicion of grave harm, the development should be blocked or, at a minimum, forced to adopt the safest possible technology, reinforcing the idea that environmental safety trumps economic expediency when high risk is involved.
Finally, we have the incredibly impactful case from the Philippines, Miners Oposa v. Factorin from 1993. This case took the precautionary principle beyond industrial toxins and applied it to the vast scale of natural resource destruction.
This case is globally recognized for introducing the concept of intergenerational equity into jurisprudence. The plaintiffs were 44 children,
Wow.
representing both their generation and future generations, who sued the government to stop the rampant granting of timber license agreements. They were effectively challenging massive deforestation across the country. They argued that the cumulative harm from logging violated their constitutional right to a balanced and healthful ecology.
That's a powerful visual. Children taking on the state to protect a resource for people who aren't even born yet.
And the court's ruling was profound. It explicitly invoked the precautionary principle to protect the forests. The judges recognized that the resource old-growth forest was finite and irreplaceable. Waiting for total ecological collapse to be scientifically charted would be waiting until the resource was permanently gone. The decision mandated that the government could not merely defer action. It had an immediate and enforceable obligation under the PP to protect these long-term resources for the future. It demonstrated the principle's utility in safeguarding the fundamental public trust, the common good, from irreversible degradation driven by short-term economic gain.
So, to summarize Section 1, the precautionary principle acts as the legal shield. If there's doubt, the creator of the risk must demonstrate safety, and the court can compel action to prevent damage, even if the final scientific data is missing. But what happens when the shield fails, or when pollution occurs despite best efforts?
Right.
That's when the financial hammer drops, leading us to the polluter pays principle.
Moving to Principle 16, the polluter pays principle, or PPP. If PP is about prevention, PPP is about restorative justice and financial accountability.
The core definition is clear, but its economic implications are what matter most. What does the PPP mandate exactly?
The PPP ensures that those who cause environmental pollution bear the costs of preventing, mitigating, or repairing the damage they cause. In economic terms, it's a policy designed to achieve the internalization of environmental externalities.
That's jargon we need to unpack for the listener. What is an environmental externality?
An externality is a cost incurred by a third party who did not agree to the transaction. So if a factory produces widgets cheaply, but the waste contaminates the downstream river, the cost of cleaning that river or the cost of the lost fishing income is an external cost.
Borne by the public.
Exactly. Borne by the public, the taxpayers, or the local villagers. PPP shifts that financial responsibility dramatically. It forces the factory owner to account for the true, complete cost of their operation on their balance sheet, ensuring that the price of the widget reflects the environmental cost of its production.
The legal basis is Principle 16 of the Rio Declaration, which states that national authorities should endeavor to promote the internalization of environmental costs, recognizing the approach that the polluter should, in principle, bear the cost of pollution. Before PPP, cleanup was often subsidized by public funds,
Right.
essentially having taxpayers fund pollution control for private profit.
It's wild to think about.
Exactly. PPP is a direct challenge to the notion that the environment is a free sink for industrial waste. It's about fairness, yes, but it's also about market efficiency. By forcing polluters to internalize the external costs, it creates a more accurate picture of true economic value.
Let's discuss the key features. It holds polluters accountable, shifts financial responsibility away from the public, and most importantly, provides a powerful economic incentive for behavioral change.
The incentive mechanism is vital. If a company knows that installing expensive advanced filtration technology now will cost, say, $5 million,
But that a catastrophic spill due to poor, cheaper filtration could cost them $50 million in court-mandated cleanup and compensation later, they have a powerful financial driver to choose the preventative measure.
it's a business decision.
It transforms environmental compliance from an abstract moral or regulatory hoop to jump through into a critical risk management function aimed at avoiding massive future liabilities.
This makes the PPP inherently forward-looking, even though it addresses costs after the fact, just like you noted the PP does. It's an investment in risk mitigation.
Absolutely. However, we do have to address the legal nuance in Principle 16 itself. It stipulates that polluters should bear the cost. But this must be done while considering public interests and, critically, without distorting international trade and investment.
Okay.
And this caveat is complex. It means environmental regulations must be applied fairly and transparently.
So a nation couldn't suddenly impose an arbitrarily high environmental tax solely on imported goods to make their domestic products cheaper. That would violate the trade neutrality clause.
Correct. That clause is designed to prevent green regulations from becoming a form of disguised protectionism. It attempts to balance global environmental ambition with the rules of international commerce, recognizing that environmental standards, especially if they're unevenly applied, can have major global economic consequences.
But let's introduce a critical challenge here. PPP sounds fantastic in theory, but what happens when the polluter is simply unable to pay? We see this constantly. Shell corporations, bankruptcies, or decades later, the polluter just doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Doesn't the public end up paying the remediation costs anyway for these orphan sites, effectively undermining the entire principle?
That is the principle's Achilles heel, and it's why sophisticated environmental law relies on mechanisms like mandatory insurance, financial assurances, or environmental bonds before hazardous activities are permitted.
So you get the money up front.
You try to. Because the moment the polluter declares bankruptcy or dissipates, the cost inevitably reverts to the taxpayer. Hence the establishment of mechanisms like the U.S. Superfund, which is essentially public money covering private failures. Furthermore, when the polluter is a state-owned enterprise, the differentiation between polluter and public purse kind of dissolves, making political will the primary driver for cleanup rather than legal mandate alone.
Okay, so let's look at the legal enforcement of PPP, which often demands not just a change in behavior, but demanding both cash for cleanup and cash for victims. Our first example is the crucial Indian Council for Enviro-Legal Action v. Union of India from 1996.
This was a landmark case addressing industries in Rajasthan that had released toxic sludge and hazardous chemicals directly onto the ground, leading to severe and deep contamination of vital groundwater sources.
Wow.
The pollution rendered land useless for agriculture and severely impacted local drinking water. This was an extreme example of internalizing zero-cost waste disposal.
What was the court's ruling here, and how did they apply the PPP?
The Supreme Court found the industries absolutely liable. They ordered the industries to pay for two distinct things, emphasizing the dual requirement of the PPP.
Okay, what were they?
First, they had to pay for cleaning up and restoring the massive environmental damage. That's remediation. This meant removing the contaminated soil and restoring the groundwater. Second, they had to pay financial compensation to the affected communities for lost livelihoods, health impacts, and property damage. That's compensation.
So fixing the land and paying the people.
Exactly. The ruling established that the polluter's liability is strict and absolute, irrespective of whether the activity was authorized or whether they took reasonable care.
That distinction between remediation and compensation is essential. Remediation is fixing the environment. Compensation is paying the people who were harmed.
Precisely. And often, courts will set up mechanisms to ensure the remediation occurs under judicial supervision, recognizing that the polluter can't really be trusted to clean up its own mess sufficiently or effectively.
Now, we have to revisit the Vellore Citizens Welfare Forum v. Union of India 1996 case, which we use for the precautionary principle. This case is so crucial because it demonstrates the synergistic application of these laws.
Indeed. Under the precautionary principle, the tanneries were required to adopt cleaner practices to prevent future harm.
Right, the shield.
But under the polluter pays principle, they were held financially liable for the damage already done to the Paler River basin. The ruling mandated them not just to stop polluting, but specifically for restoring the environment, including regenerating the soil and cleaning up the river water and compensating local residents for the loss of access to clean water and health impacts.
That's the perfect 1-2 punch.
It's the perfect illustration of how PP acts as a preventative standard, while PPP acts as the corrective measure. Both apply to the exact same problem.
Our final PPP case, TN Godavarman Thermalpad v. Union of India from 2002, moves beyond direct chemical contamination and addresses resource extraction damage, specifically deforestation and ecological harm caused by mining.
This case involved extensive illegal and unsustainable mining activities. The harm was systemic damage to the forest cover, loss of biodiversity, soil erosion. The question for the court was, how do you quantify that environmental cost under PPP?
How do you put a price on a forest?
The court's solution involved creating a specific financial mechanism for long-term repair.
Okay, how did that work?
The court mandated that the polluters, the mining companies and associated parties, must pay for forest restoration and massive reforestation efforts. More critically, the court established the precedent of imposing compensatory afforestation cessus-specific taxes or fees levied on timber and mining operations.
And that money was earmarked.
Exclusively for environmental compensation funds managed by state-level authorities. This sets a binding precedent for long-term ecological restoration funding, ensuring that the cost of exploiting natural resources includes a mandated financial contribution toward their eventual sustained recovery. This mechanism attempts to solve that long-term funding problem we often see with PPP failures.
So the precautionary principle is the preventative shield. The polluter pays principle is the financial corrective mechanism. But both of these principles operate within a vast global framework where countries have vastly different histories and capabilities, and that complexity requires a third, more politically nuanced principle, common but differentiated responsibilities.
Moving now to Principle 7 of the Rio Declaration, Common but Differentiated Responsibilities, or CBDR. This is arguably the most politically contentious and defining principle of modern international environmental agreements, particularly when it comes to climate change.
The definition is a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise. CBDR acknowledges that all nations share a common responsibility to address environmental issues, particularly global ones.
Right.
But their obligations and contributions must be differentiated based on two key factors: their historical contribution to environmental harm and their current capabilities. So their economic and technological resources.
That dichotomy is everything. We share the problem, a common responsibility for the atmosphere or the oceans, but we do not share the blame or the capacity to fix it equally.
This principle recognizes a stark reality.
Yeah.
You can't just impose the same emission reduction targets or financial obligations on a developing nation that's focused on urgent poverty alleviation and basic infrastructure development, as you do on a nation that industrialized 2 centuries ago, built its wealth on unrestricted emissions, and now possesses vast financial and technological means. It just isn't fair.
Correct. The principle confronts the undeniable historical context. Developed nations, historically defined as Annex I countries under the Kyoto Protocol, used the global atmosphere as a free carbon sink during their foundational economic rise. They contributed the vast majority of cumulative historical emissions that cause climate change today. Therefore, CBDR creates a moral and increasingly legal obligation for them to take the lead in mitigation, and crucially, in providing financial and technological resources to developing nations to help them transition to cleaner, climate-resilient development paths.
Okay, let's detail the feature set that defines this divide. Developed countries bear a greater burden. This is because of their historical emissions and their greater capacity: financial, technological, and institutional.
And conversely, developing countries are granted necessary flexibility. This flexibility acknowledges their limited resources and their legitimate right to pursue continued development to address critical socioeconomic needs. CBDR is fundamentally about promoting equity and fairness in a system that historically benefited some nations at the environmental expense of the entire planet.
But isn't this principle increasingly under strain? I mean, when CBDR was codified in 1992, the economic landscape was very different. Today, nations like China and India are among the world's largest current annual emitters, even if their cumulative historical emissions are lower than those of the US or the UK.
Right.
So does CBDR remain relevant when the developing label now applies to economic giants that possess significant capabilities?
That's the exact friction point that caused the global climate negotiations to stall for years and ultimately led to the structural shift between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement.
How so?
Kyoto rigidly defined countries as Annex I, developed with mandatory targets, and non-Annex I, developing with no mandatory targets. This rigidity became politically unworkable once large developing nations became dominant emitters.
So how did the Paris Agreement handle this friction while still respecting Principle 7?
The Paris Agreement retained the spirit of CBDR, but it softened the distinction. Instead of mandatory top-down differentiation, it introduced the concept of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs.
Where every country sets its own goal.
Every country commits to an emission reduction target based on its own assessment, exactly. The CBDR principle is operationalized by demanding that developed countries take the lead and by requiring rich nations to finance the climate actions of poorer nations while acknowledging that capacity and circumstances change over time. It's a much more dynamic interpretation of differentiation.
So it still recognizes the core idea.
It recognizes that while all hands are needed on deck, that's the common responsibility. The size of the initial cuts and the speed of transition must reflect capability. That's the differentiated responsibility.
The political tension is clear, though. Developed nations feel they're unfairly subsidizing the growth of competitor economies, while developing nations feel they're being denied the same unrestricted development path that the rich world used to achieve its current prosperity. CBDR is the legal tool attempting to balance that moral ledger.
That's a perfect summary of the tension.
Now let's see how this concept of differentiated responsibility, which is usually applied to treaties, plays out in domestic legal action within developed countries. We'll start with the major U.S. Supreme Court case, Massachusetts v. EPA from 2007.
This case centered on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's refusal to regulate greenhouse gases. They claimed they weren't air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, or that regulating them would be economically devastating. The challenge was effectively forcing a developed government to acknowledge its responsibility for its emissions.
And the Supreme Court held the U.S. government accountable for its emissions as a developed nation, forcing the EPA to regulate.
That's right. The court ruled that greenhouse gases were pollutants under the Clean Air Act, and that the EPA had the authority, and therefore the obligation, to regulate them. Now, while the court did not explicitly cite Principle 7 of the Rio Declaration, the underlying legal and moral imperative mirrored CBDR.
How so?
The U.S., as a major developed nation, could not claim a lack of capability or responsibility to act on climate change. The case served as a domestic check on government inaction, using existing law to enforce climate obligations reflective of the country's high contribution and immense capacity.
Moving to Europe, the Urgenda Foundation v. State of the Netherlands in 2015 is perhaps the most forceful judicial application of climate obligation based on developed nation capacity.
This landmark case established a global precedent. The Dutch government was sued for inadequate climate policy. Their emission reduction targets were deemed too low by scientific standards. The Urgenda Foundation successfully argued that the government was violating its duty of care to protect its citizens from climate change.
And the court explicitly emphasized the Netherlands' obligation as a developed nation.
Absolutely. The court specifically anchored its ruling on the state's responsibility arising from its position as a developed, high-income country with substantial capacity to act. The ruling cited international treaties and obligations derived from the spirit of CBDR to compel the government to reduce emissions by at least 25% by 2020 relative to 1990 levels.
Wow, specific number.
A specific legally binding number. This case demonstrates that courts are willing to enforce concrete, specific climate mitigation targets anchored by international equity principles, overriding arguments of economic inconvenience or political deferral.
Finally, let's quickly revisit the Indian Council for Environmental Legal Action v. Union of India, 1996 case, but look at it through a differentiated lens applied domestically.
This provides a subtle but important view of differentiation at the subnational level. The contamination case in Rajasthan highlighted the need for differentiated responsibilities domestically to fund and execute the cleanup.
How does that distinction play out in a court decision?
Well, the court held the polluting industries, the parties with both the historical responsibility for the harm and the superior financial and technical capacity, to a significantly higher standard of obligation for restoration and compensation than local authorities or the general public.
I see.
It recognized that even within a single developing nation, the principle of fairness applies. Those who benefit most from the harmful activity and those best equipped to fix it must bear the primary burden. It shows CBDR's influence in structuring domestic liability based on capacity and fault.
Okay, a lot to process there.
So let's synthesize these three pillars. We've established a legal framework. We have the precautionary principle, PP, acting as the preventative shield, forcing action despite uncertainty and shifting the burden of proof.
Right.
We have the polluter pays principle, PPP, acting as the financial corrective mechanism, internalizing externalities and demanding both compensation and remediation. And finally, we have CBDR acting as the global equity lens, balancing shared responsibility against historical context and current capability.
They rarely exist in isolation, do they?
Yeah.
They're constantly interacting, often in situations of high complexity and political tension. Can you walk us through a highly complex hypothetical scenario that shows all three principles interacting, maybe even conflicting?
Let's use a scenario involving a major global supply chain problem. Imagine a catastrophic toxic tailings dam collapse at a copper mine in a developing nation. Let's call it Nation D. The mine is owned by a multinational corporation, an MNC, headquartered in a developed nation, Nation A.
Okay.
And the technology used for the dam was actually banned in Nation A due to safety concerns.
Okay, let's track the principles. The collapse has caused massive, irreversible pollution of a major river basin. Where does the precautionary principle come in?
First, PP. The initial granting of the license for the dam, especially if it used a technology banned elsewhere, was likely a failure of the precautionary principle. If there was uncertainty about the stability of the dam site or the long-term impact of the tailings, and there usually is, the regulatory body in Nation D should have demanded proof of maximum safety.
Or just blocked it?
Or prohibited the design entirely, following the highest standards available globally, potentially even those from Nation A, the home country.
Okay, so that's the failure of the shield, now the financial hammer. PPP.
The cleanup. The MNC headquartered in Nation A is absolutely required under PPP to bear the cost of remediation and compensation for the local communities in Nation D. This liability is strict and absolute. The courts in Nation D, or even Nation A if jurisdiction can be established, would compel the MNC to fund the restoration of the river and compensate the victims.
And where does CBDR fit into this mess?
This is where the complexity peaks. Nation A, the headquarters country, is bound by its greater obligation under CBDR to facilitate environmentally sound practices globally. This includes regulating its MNCs operating abroad to prevent them from exploiting weaker environmental standards in Nation D.
So they have a duty to police their own companies.
In a sense, yes. Furthermore, Nation A may be morally, and perhaps legally, obligated to provide financial and technical assistance to Nation D to help manage the crisis, as Nation D likely lacks the independent capacity to handle a disaster of this scale.
And the conflict you mentioned, where does that arise?
The conflict arises when the MNC tries to declare bankruptcy in Nation D, attempting to shift the cleanup costs back onto Nation D's public purse, which undermines PPP. Simultaneously, Nation D might argue that Nation A, by failing to adequately control its MNCs through extraterritorial regulation, violated the spirit of its CBDR obligation to prevent global environmental harm.
I see.
So this hypothetical shows that the principles create a mutually reinforcing framework, but their enforcement depends entirely on jurisdictional reach, political will, and the successful prevention of PPP evasion.
These principles provide the essential, sophisticated legal vocabulary for tracking global environmental policy. They turn these abstract goals into tangible, enforceable court requirements, as we've seen from the array of successful litigation spanning continents and legal systems. They force accountability, they demand prudence, and they insert equity into negotiations.
And the case law demonstrates that judges are willing to use these principles to intervene directly in regulatory decisions, corporate conduct, and even national policy planning, especially concerning irreversible damage and climate mitigation. They are powerful tools rooted in the realization that nature cannot wait for bureaucratic consensus.
But, and this is a big but, the source material also reveals the limits of these tools. We see the legal framework established, we see repeated victories in court, the polluter pays, the precautionary principle is affirmed, yet global environmental challenges, particularly catastrophic ones like climate change and rapid biodiversity loss, they continue to accelerate. This leads us to our final provocative thought.
If we have these clear, robust, and repeatedly applied principles established in international law, PP, PPP, and CBDR, why do environmental challenges outpace legal enforcement? This raises a profound question about the future of environmental law. Perhaps the problem isn't the principles themselves, but the scale of the crisis exceeding the geopolitical framework these principles were designed to address.
It suggests that the law needs to evolve beyond state accountability and financial compensation alone. Do we need principles that grant legal standing to ecosystems themselves, things like rights of nature?
It's a real question.
Do we need to codify international crimes like ecocide to bypass the limitations of state sovereignty and the bankruptcy loopholes of PPP?
Exactly. The success of PP, PPP, and CIVDR laid the foundation. But the speed of today's crisis demands we ask where the law needs to evolve next to address non-state actors, transnational pollution, and ecological tipping points that offer zero tolerance for error. The legal architecture must meet the scale of the emergency.
A question worth taking with you as you process this deep dive. The legal principles provide the map, but the speed of change still often outpaces the pace of enforcement.
Absolutely. Thank you for diving into the fundamental pillars of environmental law with us.
Until next time, keep digging into the details.